And good. All right, we're recording. So just to start off, we're with the DYC, Democratic Youth Coalition, having a fireside chat with Delegate Karrie Delaney. So if you want to just start out with a quick introduction of yourself, go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to get to talk to you and hear about some of your priorities and see how my office can be helpful. But I'll let you know a little bit about myself. I'm Karrie Delaney. I represent the 67th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. That is parts of Chantilly and Fairfax, and as well as out to Loudoun County. And so my district runs from kind of around West Ox Road on Route 50 all the way out to South Reading. So Route 50 is kind of the heart of the district. We've got some of Herndon, Chantilly, Centerville, Oakton, and then South Reading. So I've been in the Virginia House of Delegates since I was elected in 2017. So I've had 4 sessions, not counting the various special sessions that we've had, but about 4 legislative years as delegate for the district, and have accomplished some really great things that I'm very proud of. You know, that we can get into detail at a later point if you have some questions about specific policies. But you know, I've passed a variety of bills on a lot of different issues. I care a lot about issues that affect children and education. My background, that actually was what inspired me to originally run for office, comes from my background in the human service field, where I worked in foster care. I was a sexual assault crisis counselor, and I worked with an organization that fought human trafficking. So legislation in those spaces is also very important to me, and I've passed a number of bills in those areas. But I think where it really comes together with meetings like this, I've also passed a number of bills and work on a number of issues that are very much from the people that I represent, issues that I may not have even known existed or really realized that there was a legislative need for a fix until someone sat down and had a meeting with me and told me a story about something that was affecting their life or their family. And we're reaching out to their legislator to look for a solution and being able to put in a bill in to solve those kind of day-to-day problems and concerns and issues that people have to make the Commonwealth better for everyone. Some of the best bills that I've had were not ideas that just popped into my own brain. They were ideas that came from meetings that I had with people in the community. And so that's why having these type of conversations is so important to me, because I think it's important that that we all understand kind of how the process should work. And I think the process should work by those of you in the community who, you know, are having ideas or concerns or problems that you've encountered and think, wow, I think there could be better policy at the state level to address this, knowing that that's what we're here for. That's what your legislator is there for, to sit with you and talk about what those issues are, find a solution together. And if that means, you know, someone like me putting forward a bill to fix a problem, then, you know, I'm always happy and honored to look at that and to do that when possible. But I think it all starts with having these conversations.
Great. Thank you. So we have some policy centric questions, but before we get into those, I do have one question that just popped in my head. So which bill would you say that you're most proud of in your time as delegate so far?
So, you know, I was asked that question recently, and it took me a second, because I had to. It's an election year this year, so it's this kind of a time of the year where I'm now thinking, okay, what are the issues that I've worked on that I really want to make sure that voters get a chance to hear about too. And so it's kind of giving me this opportunity to sort of sit down and just look back at some of the legislation that I've carried over these past 4 legislative sessions, and, you know, really given thought to, okay, which of these is the one that kind of comes up to the top for me. And I have to say, it's actually a really hard question for me to answer, because as soon as I think of one, then something else will pop in my head. Like, well, that was a really exciting one too. So it is a really hard question for me to answer. I don't know that I can honestly just pick one, but I will say that one that kind of came up to the top of my thoughts at one point was a piece of legislation that I passed a few years ago, actually, that deals with requiring that members of clergy report child abuse. And that was something that I felt especially at that time, was incredibly timely. This was during, you know, this was a year where every day in the newspaper, there would be some some headline that had to do with, you know, something to do with abuse as it related to clergy or churches. And it seemed incredibly timely in that moment to put forward legislation. And this was, by the way, something that came from a constituent, even though it was very much kind of on our minds because it was in the press a lot. It actually was a sit down that I had a start with someone in the community who told their story of what had happened in their church and with people that they knew and cared about, and that there had been essentially kind of a cover up of some allegations that had taken place, and felt that very strongly that there really should be laws that require that members who are members of clergy would need to report child abuse in the same way that a teacher, a counselor, any other trusted member of the community that sort of has that responsibility of being an authority figure in their community would be required to make those reports of child abuse or neglect, just like any of those other professionals. So that was certainly one that's come to mind. But I know I've asked which one, so it's hard for me to follow that rule because I do have to also say that another issue that I am incredibly proud of my work on, and that isn't done yet, and this is another reason why I'm going to be working so hard to win my reelection this November, because I need to make sure that I'm back in Richmond, because there's still a lot of work to be done. And that's on the subject of forensic nursing. That's the issue that relates to victims of crime who go to hospital for, perhaps a sexual assault or domestic violence against them. There's the need for that physical evidence to be collected that can be used in court. And that can only be done by a certain type of nurse. So that's forensic nursing. Not all of the hospitals in Virginia have equal access or have equal staffings of forensic nurses. Some do not have forensic nurses, which means victims of crime sometimes need to travel quite far in hopes of finding a facility that does have forensic care. There's a lot of reasons that I won't take all the time, because I could make this whole talk about that, and I won't do that. But there's a lot of reasons why, that it's very important that victims of crime have access to that type of care for the most simple reason that it's part of justice. And to be able to have the physical evidence needed to have your day in court, and to have someone who accountable for that. And that is something that, depending on where you live in Virginia, that access to justice is very unequal. And we've made some great strides in this space, but it's a complicated issue that still has a lot of work left to do. And so I'm very much committed to, continuing to fight that fight down in Richmond.
Awesome. Thank you. So could you go into some detail about some of the policing and criminal justice reforms that you've helped get through in the community?
Absolutely. And so that has been a very important issue for us in the General Assembly. We did have a special session. That's why I mentioned, for legislative years, I had 4 regular sessions, but we have had a number of special sessions that have dealt on some specific issues. And one of those was very recently on the subject of police reform. And so there has certainly been a very loud and vocal and necessary cry from the community to address this, and to say that, enough is enough. This is something we need to take swift and bold action on immediately. And we couldn't wait until the next legislative year to take some of that action. It needed to be done immediately. And so we were able to go into a special session to start to address some of those issues. And, I think that in my analysis of this, and in some of the pieces of legislation and some of the conversations we've had, that I think go towards solving the problem for the long haul, is recognizing that, we need to do all that we can to make sure that those who go into the field of policing are both properly screened and vetted upon hiring, that they are then properly trained, and that needs to include in cultural sensitivity as well as in de-escalation, and have a better understanding of mental health and other types of kind of human behavior that one might encounter in a crisis, or just generally out in the field, to know maybe when they're outside of their scope or into more of a mental health situation, and having resources to call the right people, or even have those people, as we had with one piece of legislation, potentially deployed with them, so that if you're coming upon a crisis, you're not looking at it through the lens of, how do I enforce this as a enforcer of the law, as much as how do I assist this situation through the lens of more of kind of community support and mental health. And then I think the other side of that then, so we've got the, screening upon hiring, we've got the training upon, being kind of released out into the field and understanding that de-escalation. We also had passed a bill that dealt with decertification, which means that if you do something wrong when you're out in the field, that we expanded some of those reasons why law enforcement can be decertified and not able to continue to serve as law enforcement. It was a very limited list of reasons why an officer could be decertified. And I think it's important that we look at expanding those to include some of the more, compelling reasons that indicate that this is a pattern that can't necessarily be corrected. And then I'll go on to say that, while we haven't addressed this in legislation yet, I think another aspect that I'm really committed to continuing to work on in the future as well is also looking at, what are the tools that we need to make sure that those law enforcement who are the good apples, the ones who have been properly vetted, been properly trained, they're doing their best to be fair and equitable, to make sure that they're also receiving the supports that they need to stay that way, because they too are also encounter trauma on a daily basis, sometimes out in the field. And we need to make sure that we're giving them the supports and the tools that they need to make sure that, that they are staying emotionally healthy to the trauma that they're incurring themselves, to ensure that, they're not then reflecting that back in the community in a negative way, and kind of sliding into a space that they didn't begin with. And so I think it's kind of a long road that we have to really systematically change what policing looks like in Virginia and frankly across the country. But we did start with some very reasonable steps to move us in that direction, as well as just eliminating some of the really unnecessary things like banning chokeholds and eliminating the no-knock warrants, where we know that there's really just no reason to implement some of those practices. And we had a lot of law enforcement even able to come and speak in support of those bills, to say that that is very timely and necessary and the right thing to do. So we're certainly continuing to work on a lot of these issues, because it's a very important issue that really needs the time and attention to make sure we do it and we do it right.
Right, and tell us more about the removal of the sexual assault in the General Assembly.
Was that, I'm sorry, Tor, could you say that again? You cut out at the sexual assault.
Tell us more about the removal of the sexual assault.
The sexual assault loophole, was that, I might be having a bad internet connection. So that, I assume you're talking about my piece of legislation that I carried that dealt with sexual assault as it relates to law enforcement. So when we had that special session on police reform, the bill that I carried was one that closed a pretty awful loophole that, quite honestly, a lot of people, I think, were surprised when I explained my bill, realized even was there, that it was something that was even allowed in the first place. And that is that it was to ban carnal knowledge between a law enforcement officer and someone who was in their custody. So if you can imagine the incredible power imbalance when you are maybe pulled over or stopped by a law enforcement officer. You might not be arrested yet, but they're holding you in a way that makes you feel like you can't just drive off. Like if you get pulled over, you're not allowed to just drive off. You haven't been arrested, but you can't just say, okay, I'm not staying here. You have to stay. So you're in that state of kind of being detained. Prior to my bill passing, that those two individuals would, under the law, be able to engage in some kind of sexual relations, often which I think clearly, given the power imbalance, would have been an exploitation of the person who was being detained by a law enforcement officer. Unfortunately, there had been some cases where women had been raped by law enforcement officers, but then the law enforcement officer, when they came to court, they would make the claim that it was consensual. Well, I think that in that kind of dynamic, there is no room for consent. It is a very clear abuse of power. And it's very clearly an inappropriate scenario where consent should never have been allowed to have been introduced as a defense for those actions. It erases that loophole, it erases that power imbalance, and I think ensures that people will not be exploited by law enforcement officers. And I think that it also protects, protects everybody, to be quite honest. And so that was a bill that that I carried and passed during our special session on police reform.
So what's an issue that's unique to Fairfax County and your district that you would like to help fix or solve in the coming months and years?
Well, that's a really good question. What's unique to this district in Fairfax County? I think that, Fairfax County does have some very specific concerns and issues that maybe aren't heard as much in other parts of the state. We're certainly not the only part of Virginia with traffic congestion problems, but I think that we're definitely up there on the top of the list of people who get to complain the most about it, just because of the nature of of this region. Sure, there's other roads in Virginia that need some attention, and certainly some congestion issues around the Commonwealth, but I think that is probably one where Northern Virginians kind of align, regardless perhaps even of their political party, can kind of get behind the idea that that we have a lot of problems with traffic up here. And so I would say that that is probably one that is kind of the common thread that all of us Northern Virginians share, is the frustration with roads and traffic and congestion. And I think that what we're working on to do that is to continue to fight for the reinstatement of some of the lost transportation funds that we lost when Democrats were still in the minority. There had been an unfortunate shift of funding in order to fund a very necessary portion of Metro. We certainly agree with the funding of Metro. It was the way we went about it, by taking $100 million away from Northern Virginia's transportation budget to do so, that I think was very unfortunate. And we've spent the last several years getting closer and closer to reinstating as much of that as we can. And so that's something that, I'm continuing to be very aware of. I hear that a lot from constituents, and fighting for when I go down to Richmond, to recognize that, there's ways I think that we can work with delegates from regions outside Northern Virginia to kind of, look at some of these different priorities that we have as transportation is concerned, and look for ways to, support all of these initiatives, but to really recognize that, Northern Virginia, we're an economic hub for the rest of Virginia. And it's important that we ensure that we are making good investments here, so that we continue to be the kind of place where people want to come and work, where businesses want to be. And I think having access to multimodal transportation solutions, that includes Metro, it includes more access to rail, but it also includes, I think, investing in our existing road infrastructure to make sure that, that congestion is relieved as much as it can be. But I do think that it's a multimodal approach that we need to take, that also includes in making those investments in things like Metro and alternative modes of transportation as well.
Right, well, I'm kind of chasing this question up because you are already in the House of Delegates, but if reelected, what is the number one priority that you'd like to see in this term of office?
So I think my number one priority is very much, I think, tied to the moment that we're in right now. This past year with COVID has been an incredible challenge for the world, really. I mean, I can say for this community, but let's be honest, it's for the whole world. But our country, our state, our local communities have all been impacted in just nearly immeasurable ways by COVID. And I think the recovery from that, from an economic standpoint and also from an education standpoint, is going to need to be really at the center of our attention as policymakers and as legislators this coming session, and quite really beyond that as well. I think that, with kids being in virtual environments for school for over a year now in this area, there is going to need to be a lot of special attention given to ensure that our students have access to, all the proper tools to measure any learning loss that may have happened during their time out of the traditional classroom, to remediate that learning loss, as well as the lost opportunities to find and identify other learning challenges that students may have. I've done a lot of work in the space of students with dyslexia. And I know that some of those policies expand beyond students with dyslexia, but to reading and literacy for all students, and just understanding that, especially in early childhood, how important it is that students meet those early literacy benchmarks. Because reading performance by third grade is a major indicator of many forms of academic success and life success beyond the third grade. And we've missed the opportunity to possibly identify some flags for students who may have challenges in that space and may need intervention and remediation, and to make sure that that is given, in an evidence-based way. And then I think just also looking at the larger scope beyond the educational impact that students have had being outside of the physical classroom, but the emotional, social, and mental health aspect that this has had on our students. We recognize that, students have been isolated, students have been afraid. There's going to be an increase in, anxiety and other mental health challenges as they re-enter the classroom. I mean, I know getting back out into the community for all of us has been a big shift, and it's going to be harder for some people than others to kind of reacclimate into the way things were, or into whatever the new normal is going to look like. And I think that it's going to be very important that we are prepared to offer the educational, academic, remedial, and mental health supports to all of our students as they enter the classroom, and recognize that it's not going to be just, okay, we're back, it's back to normal now. It's going to take some time, and we're going to have to be investing our energy and making sure that we're really there for our students. And then the other side of that too, I think, is just our economic recovery in general, recognizing that it's going to take a while. There's been businesses that have been hit hard, and even though I hope we're on kind of the rebound here, it's going to take some time, and it might take some proactive measures from the General Assembly to make sure that we're, supporting our businesses, supporting our small businesses, and making sure that we have a strong economic recovery.
Thank you. And you've already gone into a lot of the pandemic related aspects and struggles of schooling, but do you have anything else that you'd like to talk to in your platform as it relates to public schools, their funding, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got 2 kids in public school. They're elementary age students. So I do feel, one benefit that I hope that I'm adding to my district in particular is that, all of the parents who have been struggling with this challenge of having children home in virtual school, trying to figure out how to balance your own work, virtual work, being away, finding childcare, all of these issues that we know our communities have been struggling with. I've been right there along with you. I've been trying to juggle the same juggle, and some days it works out. Other times, I feel like I could lose my mind. So we were literally all in this together, and I do understand very firsthand the challenge that this has had on families, because I've got a 2nd grader and a 5th grader, and we've been living this as well, and it's been hard for all of us. And so I do recognize that and understand that. And so I think, as we have the opportunity to prepare for our response as a Commonwealth to this, I feel very in tune to what I think the supports and needs are going to need to be, because I know as a parent, what am I worried about for my children, making sure that they're really ready to go back in the classroom, and that they're properly, at grade level, or where they should be when they do return to the classroom, and especially by the end of that year, to make sure that the teachers have the resources that they need. And so I think that's where it goes to from a policy standpoint, is we do need to make sure that our teachers and our school districts have the resources that they need to do their job and to do it well, and to offer that world-class education. And that means making sure that our teachers are paid competitively, for the work that they do, that they're shown, kind of the appreciation and respect for the year that they've been through, because it has not been easy. This has been an unprecedented challenge for our educators. And so to make sure that we're doing all that we can to thank them for what they've done, to ensure that, we're welcoming them back into a safe environment where they've had access in many cases now in Virginia to vaccines, that we're making sure that, the school environment is safe and following all the CDC guidelines for safety, that we're paying competitive wages, and that we're doing all we can to retain that incredible talent of educators here in Virginia, to make sure that we're offering and continuing to offer a world-class education. And I think that means, offering world-class education in a way that means world-class for everybody, that we need to make sure that we have all of the strong programs for students who excel academically and need to be challenged in advanced placements, to make sure that we have those opportunities to encourage, the cutting edge careers that are going to be so important and vital to Virginia's future economy, STEM careers, tech careers, data science careers, that the curriculum is robust, and that we are really, creating opportunity for our students to be world class. But we also need to make sure that world class means students of all varying abilities, and that we're offering that, for as much as we're offering excellent advanced placement programming, that we are equally offering excellent and world class services for students who have other challenges or have other needs, for special education, for remediation for things like dyslexia and other literacy challenges, all of those special education needs. We need to make sure that we're also world-class there. And that's something that's really important to me, especially as we come out of this pandemic, to really make sure, as we talk about what this means to be one of the top school districts in the country here in Fairfax County, that means all students. And that means that our special ed students are also receiving that top-notch service that is evidence-based and the best in the country as well.
Right, and our next question is, what are some initiatives you believe should be taken to protect funding for healthcare clinics?
Well, I think if this year has shown us nothing, it is how important access to healthcare is for everybody. And especially when you're looking at something like a pandemic, where healthcare is not isolated. If my family has healthcare and the family next door doesn't, it doesn't matter if it's a pandemic, because someone else not being able to see a doctor affects you. And I think many of us have seen healthcare beyond how it affects us personally, and recognize that it is community health. But I think that something like a global pandemic has really shown the spotlight on how important it is that all of us have access to healthcare, because it really does affect all of us. And I hope that, that one of the positives that will come out of how we respond to the aftermath of this pandemic is that we have shown the spotlight on some deficits in our community. And perhaps this will be one that we can have changed the minds of some folks who maybe hadn't seen it the way that some of us had been seeing it in the past. And I think that goes to ensuring that, we need to break down any barriers that prevents anyone from being able to get the medical care they need, no matter where they live across Virginia, or no matter what they can afford. Access to healthcare, I think, is fundamental. We did a lot to break down those barriers with Medicaid expansion, and it is incredible just to see the numbers going up every year with how many more Virginians now have access to healthcare that didn't, since we passed that bill way back my first session in Richmond. But I think that, we need to continue to do more about access and affordability for healthcare across Virginia.
Thank you. Another policy related question: what is your stance, or what are some of your policy proposals for increasing accessibility and inclusiveness for those of us with disabilities?
And is that question specifically as it relates to healthcare?
No, not healthcare specific, just in general.
Okay. Well, I think that what comes immediately to mind, and I guess it could apply to healthcare or anything else, is that, again, another thing I think we've kind of learned through this past year, for as many challenges and heartbreaks as this past year has brought us as a community, I am hoping that we'll have learned some lessons that will make us better in the end. And one of those, I think, is that technology, while it has been very frustrating at times to, rely so heavily on everything with technology, that it really has opened up opportunities for increased access that didn't exist before. Being in virtual session this January and February, seeing the opportunity for people to participate in our hearings, and to have, the barrier that driving to Richmond, maybe taking a day off of work, driving to Richmond, getting into the Capitol building, getting into the hearing room, that's a barrier for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And that was, that was the best way to advocate for a piece of legislation that you were passionate about. The fact that we had that virtual option where people were able to come on into the Zoom and make their testimony, I think really broke down a lot of the barriers to, accessing your government. And I think that that's going to be something that we look at how to make sure that we can continue to incorporate that as we do start to get back together and do more things in person, making sure that, accessibility is key. I think the other part of that would be, listening to you and listening to people and getting your ideas and your suggestion, and making sure that we are including the voices of people who are most impacted by the decisions that we make, and that, we're taking those voices, and having those seats at the table while we're making those decisions. And so making sure that, we're out in the community and open and accessible, so that if there's something that's been overlooked and someone has an idea of a way that we could be doing something better, that we know that we have somebody that will, work with us on that, to make sure that, we've got representation across the board, and to represent the variety of voices of Virginians.
On a personal note, thank you for being a huge disabilities advocate for Virginians, including myself. So the next question we have is, what is your stance on paid internships, and will you commit to paying interns either in the General Assembly or on the campaign?
Definitely. I think that that this is something that has gotten a lot more attention over these past few years, honestly, that, access to internships has kind of been this prior, less discussed kind of point of privilege, where those who could afford to work for free had this sudden access to opportunities that could then help them accelerate their careers, make the right connections, kind of be in the right rooms to meet the right people, and then have, their careers and their opportunities blossom from there. I think that we need to eliminate that track that excludes a lot of really talented, qualified, amazing people, just on the fact that, they're not willing to, or not able to do a job that isn't paid. And just breaking down that barrier of access to opportunity and real life learning. Because I'll tell you, thinking, and this could apply, I think, across the board to a lot of different industry, but, working on policy, working as a legislator, you can think, like how a bill passes, or like how, how legislation works, or how Richmond works. And you're not really going to understand it till you're there and you watch it happen and you do it every day and you're there for a little. I mean, there's just a whole nother level of really getting how the process works by being there and doing that. And internships and opportunities to be involved, whether it be in a campaign or in a legislative office. I mean, they're really incredible learning opportunities, and they shouldn't just be limited to people who can afford them. It really should be something where we take down those barriers. And so I think the more opportunities that we have in our offices to offer, stipends and wages, and breaking down some of those economic barriers to the talented, students and young people who are looking for that real life experience, that's something that I'm very passionate about, making sure that, people have access to those experiences, because there really is nothing else like it. And the more, diversity that we can have in thought and life experience in those spaces, I think helps our offices, because then we're getting perspectives beyond, a more narrow scope that may have traditionally been. And I think that that's really important for us as lawmakers as well, just to make sure that, our offices have people who can bring up different ideas and different perspectives that maybe we hadn't heard or considered before.
What are some specific initiatives that relate to veterans, whether it be access to healthcare, housing, or anything else, veteran specific?
Yeah, veterans issues are really important for this area for sure, because this is obviously an area where we've got a lot of active military, retired military veterans are here in this area, and a huge part of our community. My dad worked for the Veterans Administration Hospital when I was growing up, and so I had opportunities when I was young. Anytime I needed service hours or anything like that, I could go to work with him and spend some time helping out at the VA hospital. And that certainly gave me, just growing up with that, a lot of perspective about just how important it is that the needs of these folks are met, and that we're doing all that we can as a community and as a society to support our veterans and ensure that they have excellent care and access to those resources. And so I have been, a very proud supporter of a variety of pieces of legislation that have come through the General Assembly to support our veterans in many of those spaces. I personally carried a piece of legislation that requires that when the DMV registers a new person in Virginia, maybe you're going to get a driver's license, and there's a box you check that says that you have served. That will automatically result in you receiving a variety of information about the resources and the services that are offered in this area and in Virginia. Prior to that, there was you check the box, but it didn't necessarily result in anything. And we have so many excellent services here in Virginia that making sure that people are just made immediately aware of them when they do become Virginia residents, I think is really important. And so that is something that I will continue to be supportive of those the initiatives that many of my colleagues have also carried, and I've co-patroned and voted for those bills, but we'll look for opportunities to be supportive in the future as well.
Okay, so we're down to our final two questions in this fireside chat. What is your stance on Virginia transitioning to clean energy?
So I think our transition to clean energy is essential. Again, I'll go back to my earlier comment about my family, that I've got two young kids. So when I look at Virginia and our world's future, thinking about it through the eyes of a mother, I need to make sure that the policies that I'm supporting are going to ensure that my children have a clean earth and a good environment to exist in when they're grown up, and that these problems aren't just going to be theirs to either deal with or solve, that we cannot be too aggressive with addressing the crisis of climate change now. I think that we can do that intelligently by looking at the science and getting on a swift plan to move away from fossil fuels and move to green energy by an aggressive timeline. I think in doing that, what's also very important is that we have an economic development plan in place for those regions of Virginia that will be most impacted by that shift. I've carried legislation for green job tax credits. I carried a piece of legislation which unfortunately died in the Senate, but it's an issue that I'm going to continue to talk about, which is that when we are transitioning to green energy, we have to recognize that there's parts of the Commonwealth who currently rely on fossil fuel for jobs. It's a major part of their economy. We need to make sure that we have a plan and a message for those Virginians as well. And I think that it's important that those regions guide their future, that those and what my commission would have done would have had, the various stakeholders, economic development authorities, and leaders from those regions come to the table and kind of create a plan of what do we want our economy to look like by the time we're transitioned away from fossil fuel. It might be manufacturing, it might be something to do with green energy, but you know what? It might also be tourism. It might be some other type of manufacturing. It could be something else, but I think that it's important that those regions make those decisions and that they are the ones who guide their future with the support of the General Assembly to meet the aggressive timeline that I think we need to meet in order to really address climate change as aggressively as we need to. So I think, moving towards more wind and more solar is incredibly important, and making sure that we do that in a way that also keeps in mind the economic needs of all of Virginians as it comes to the ratepayers, but also the local economies of those parts of Virginia that are most impacted by the transition, to make sure that we're really working mindfully to help that transition be as smooth as possible. And I think that will require that the legislature be aware of that and help guide that transition in any way that we can.
Awesome. So that was the last of the policy related questions, but we have one more question before closing remarks and finishing up. But this is more of a fun question. What TV show are you watching right now?
Oh my goodness, what TV show am I watching right now? That's a great question. I'm trying to think like because I get through these series, right? Like I'll get on Netflix and I'll watch something, and then, I'll move on to something else. Trying to think, is there something that we're watching that's good right now? My daughter, I guess I mean I could think about this and take too much time. My daughter has gotten into like science fiction lately, and so she's 11, and so my husband started showing her the old episodes of Star Trek, and we're trying to figure out like which like generation or whatnot she's most interested in. So lately she's been asking at night for us to go downstairs after I put my son to bed, because he's too young. He claims he thinks it's a little scary to watch these old episodes. So I think that's kind of the fun thing about Netflix and Amazon Prime is you can kind of relive like times past and find shows that you might have seen growing up and sort of re-see them again through your child's eyes. So that's how our family's been spending our time. I need to find the new series though. If anybody has any recommendations, let me know, like what's good on Netflix, because we're busy campaigning and legislating. I feel like I'm always behind, like I don't know what's even out. So send me your recommendations. I need something to de-stress after a long day of knocking doors.
Oh, Tori, you're muted, Tori.
I was like, Delegate, you should definitely watch The Office. It will be through comedians and
Yeah, comedy is good. Any comedy recommendations are good. I feel like that's
Parks and Rec could be pretty good.
Yeah, I've watched Parks and Rec, and I feel like, and I'll put this out here. I feel like this is my proprietary idea, but I honestly think that I would love to see a show like Parks and Rec, but about the state legislature. I think it would be hilarious for those of us in it. But I mean, kind of like Parks and Rec, like it's funny even if you've never worked in like city government. It's still funny. But if you have worked in city government, which I have at a point in my career, you get like even more of the inside jokes. So I think we've got something. So if there's any like aspiring screenwriters or producers or anybody out there, let's talk, because I got some content for you.
thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Some
Sure. Well, thank you again for taking the time to talk with me and to ask me questions. I guess I, would really just like to close by kind of sharing my perspective on how I'd like to see things moving forward with all of us, is that, you are seeing your representative, whether it's me or, whoever represents the district where you may live. But knowing that, we're part of this together, and that this really only works when we are meeting with and hearing from the people that we represent. To kind of drive home the point I made earlier, the best bills that I've passed, the bills that I'm the most proud of, some of those came from my work experience, and maybe that's where my passion for them came from. But the real solutions and the real like nuggets of the ideas, the best bills that I've passed and the ones that I feel like really impact the people the most came from conversations that I had with people in the community who brought to my attention issues that, not everybody might even know exist. I've had constituents bring me issues that I wouldn't have had any idea that those problems existed had they not sat down with me and told me about it. But just knowing that, that's how this should work, that, folks should be able to meet with their legislator, bring forward their ideas, their issues, their concerns, and then we can work together to figure out a solution, whether that's a bill or whether it's, just figuring out some other kind of, helping you navigate the state agencies to get the answers that you might need. But just knowing that, we are kind of a team in this. And I have a great track record of passing legislation, but I don't think I could have done that as well if I didn't have really amazing advocates who helped me, kind of come up with the best proposal for a bill, and then also advocated and lobbied and helped get things past the finish line. So I just want you to know your voice in this is so incredibly important.
Great. Well, Delegate, thank you for taking the time. I want to say on a personal note, I'm really going to miss having you, my elected official. And also thank you to your office for setting up this meeting today. And personal thanks to your office for helping me with the whole vaccine distribution issue. That got resolved. And thank you for taking the time. And we hope you have a great rest of your Saturday.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all so much. Keep in touch.